My name is Laura Shanti Moreno, and I'm a professor at Brooklyn College. And today we are going to look at the Common Core standards and considerations for emergent bilingual students. This is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart because I was a dual language Spanish-English bilingual teacher for 12 years in Brooklyn. And as we dig into the Common Core state standards, it's really important to think about what implications does it have for our planning and teaching of bilingual students. So what are we doing today? The first thing is we're going to think about who are our emergent bilingual students and what are their different needs. The second thing is we're going to look at what's currently in place for bilingual students in the Common Core state standards. And lastly, we're going to think about how can we plan for these students with the Common Core state standards in mind. So who are emergent bilingual students? New York City is an immensely diverse environment with a range of emergent bilingual students. And as you notice, I say emergent bilinguals instead of English language learners. And that choice is a stance because the term English language learner, which is used by the New York City Department of Education, takes more of a deficit view. It looks at the students as needing English, which they do, but it doesn't acknowledge their that they're bilingual students and they possess knowledge in literacy and in language in their home language. And sometimes our students are multilingual as well. So I prefer to use the word emergent bilingual, which refers to and acknowledges that students are bilingual and they're emerging, they're developing in both languages. There are times I use the term L when I'm talking about the New York City Department of Education context. So close to 42% of students in New York City speak a language other than English at home. And what I love about the statistic is it really demonstrates that New York City is a multilingual environment. Rather than being incidental or kind of a minority, it's really close to half. Close to half of the children in New York City speak other languages other than English at home. Of those 42% of students, about 14% of students are labeled L. This means that when they came into the New York City school system and were processed by taking an assessment called the Lab R, if they scored below a certain threshold on this exam, the Lab R, then they were labeled as English language learners or students in need of extra English instruction. And they're mandated, depending on their level, they're mandated to receive 45 or 90 minutes of targeted ESL instruction. Of the students labeled Ls by the DOE, 47% of the students were born abroad. And what's so interesting about this is we often think of students who are emergent bilinguals as students who are immigrants who come to this country. But more than half of them actually are born in the U.S. and used their home language until they came to school. So a lot of these students are American and simply operate in different languages before coming to school. And I love this statistic as well. There's 151 languages spoken by students in the New York City Department of Education. The way that they're distributed ranges throughout the city, as I will speak about later. So are all the emergent bilinguals the same, and what are their abilities? Sometimes we get into the habit of grouping students into subgroups, like those are special needs students and those are Ls or emergent bilinguals, and without recognizing that there's diversity within those groups. And one of the ways in which bilingual students differ from each other is their level of proficiency. Some students are just beginning to learn the new language or English, and some students are well on their way to learning English. Furthermore, students may have different levels of social language, and when I say social language, it refers to the language that's needed in order to get around, to be with friends, to talk colloquially, gestures versus academic language, which is more formalized language when we are talking about content. So here on this slide, you'll see that there are 5 different levels of or stages of language proficiency, and that's all the way on the left, starting from pre-production and ending with advanced fluency. And this chart demonstrates what we can expect at this stage and what are some things that teachers can do to elicit responses from students at each of these stages. So the first stage is called pre-production, and this is often referred to as the silent stage. It's when students are just beginning to operate in that language, and usually there's silence because they don't know many words and they have minimal comprehension. So they can nod yes or no, but at this point they're just becoming comfortable with listening to and existing in a different language. And something that's important to consider is that at each of these stages there is an additional kind of psychological component. So imagine if you were in a country where you didn't speak the language. At the beginning there would be emotions that you would feel, such as maybe fear, apprehension. So students are also feeling these things, and that's important to be aware of. So at this stage, teachers need to be highly supportive and do a lot of the language work and demonstration for students. And they can elicit some responses by saying, show me, circle this, where is that? And asking students, instead of verbalizing, to point. And teachers are going to use basic ESL techniques like total physical response, or TPR, where you're really using your hands and acting out. Once students begin to acquire limited vocabulary, they're in the early production stage. So at this point, students have limited comprehension. They can understand some phrases and some keywords like bathroom or lunchtime or raise your hand. And they have 1 or 2 word responses, and they can participate using keywords and phrases. So at this point, teachers can begin asking yes or no questions, or questions in which there's a choice. Do you think Curious George is good or bad, for example? And then the kid, you're providing the language so the kid can say good. And you're providing language so that they can fill in one word. For example, what do you think? I think that, and the kid can say, it's good. Something very simple. As these are like building blocks. So as students begin to acquire more and more language, they enter into the speech emergence stage of language proficiency, where they have relatively good comprehension and can produce simple sentences. They're still relatively a beginner, but they're beginning to really gain an understanding of how language works and how they can acquire vocabulary. So you can ask why, how, and explain questions, again, with the additional scaffold of providing them with sentence frames or sentence starters that could help them produce a sentence. After this stage, the last 2 stages are intermediate and advanced. The intermediate is when children have excellent comprehension, and usually at this stage they have really great social language and are able to hold friendships and develop relationships with students and teachers. And at this stage, you can ask them more complex and demand more complex expressive language from them. What would happen if Curious George went to the zoo? What do you think would happen if? Or why do you think this happened? And kids can begin, and sometimes they still need the language scaffold, but kids can begin using more complex language in response to your questions. And then advanced fluency are advanced emergent bilinguals, and their use of the new language or English is on par or equal with their home language. And they can pretty much operate as your general education students can. But once again, with all students who are English language learners, they still may need support in language. They still may need vocabulary and language support. Apart from their levels of proficiency, they may have other different needs. So again, this group is really heterogeneous. It's very different from each other. There are ethnic differences. As you remember, there's 151 different languages that are spoken, and they come from all different parts of the world. There's differences in migration, the way the 47% of students who were born abroad, how did they come to the U.S.? Did they come with their mom? Did they come alone? Did they join their mom after their mom was working in the U.S. for 5 or 6 years? Were they living with their grandmother? All those things are really essential because when we're learning language, as I said previously, it's really a psychological experience. It's an emotional experience as well. Sometimes students are sent to live with their parents in this country, so their parents came prior to their arrival for 5 or 6 years, and they were very comfortable living with their grandmother. And then they're brought to this country, and it's very different. And there may be some pushback on learning English because they're resistant to being in this country in the first place. Or they're, if not this country, they're resistant to kind of what has happened to them. There's differences in educational history. There are some students which are labeled SIFE, students with interrupted formal education, and these students either skipped a year or more in school and therefore are behind, or sometimes their education has not been on par with what's expected in the U.S. So they may have been in 5th grade in one place, but when they come to 5th grade in the Bronx, the expectations for 5th grade may be much higher or very different from what's expected where they came from. Then another category or group of students are labeled long-term English language learners. These are English language learners that were designated by the Department of Education that have been able to test out of the end of year exam called the NYSESLAT. The NYSESLAT is a New York State exam which assesses students' progress on English goals in reading, writing, speaking, and listening. And at a certain point, students test out because they reach a certain threshold on the NYSESLAT. But if they don't test out, they remain eligible for services. And if you remain eligible for services for 7 years, that's considered by the Department of Education as a very extended period of time, and those students are labeled LTELs. So, given that there's such a diversity in language proficiency, educational history, and educational strength of students, how do we work with the Common Core state standards? So, the basic, if we were to kind of distill and think about what do the Common Core state standards represent for teaching, it really is that the goal is for students to be able to read, write, and think at high levels on their own, and to be able to digest a whole range of different types of text, nonfiction and literature, and to be able to have a unique perspective on it. And that's something that is required in college, and it's something that I think is important for students to understand, that they can make meaning and understand what they read. So in order for emergent bilingual students to be able to do this, we need to think about how do we work with these students at different language proficiencies, and what kind of additional supports may they need. So I'd like to take a little step into looking at what academic language is, because when we're talking about bilingual students, we really need to think about language. So I had mentioned social and academic language. It exists on a continuum. It's not that they're separate. And that's important to realize, because when we're thinking about academic language, which is so difficult for students to obtain and use, we have to realize that since it's exists on a continuum. We can build our academic language from the social language. Context is really important for the development of both of these languages. One of the reasons why social language is so easy to acquire is because social language has a lot of context. So if I go to the pizza place and I don't know a lot of the words, I'll end up learning those words really quickly because everything is right there. I want some pizza. I would like some soda with that. Where's the plate? All of that is readily available and I can interact with it and touch it. Sometimes what's difficult about academic language is that the context is not there. Teachers may begin to talk about the solar system or electricity without actually having students experience it first. And it's difficult to experience some of these things, for example, the solar system, as I said. But we need to bring these experiences into students, make them available for students. So, for example, before reading about the solar system, it may be important to show them models or to get a video and bring them to the museum. And these things take time, but they are essential for students to acquire the academic language that they need to comprehend difficult texts. So here's an example of the spectrum between social language and academic language. And we played ball. It's very basic. The language is getting more complex. Yesterday, I went to the park with John and we played ball. Even more complex. Yesterday, we were playing ball. We hit and broke the window across the street and we ran. It's getting longer, but there are also phrases. There are also more exact verbs. And academic language. Many ancient cultures had games that involved playing with a round object that could be compared to a ball, the Aztecs, for example, and then it goes on. But here you can see that in academic language, really it's about the same topic, about playing ball, but it becomes more and more advanced. By the end, a round object refers to a ball. And in order to understand what that means, we have to have that social language. We build off social language in order to build academic language. So what's currently in place for bilingual students? New York State has hired some professors from CUNY and to develop the Bilingual Common Core Initiative. And the Bilingual Common Core Initiative has 5 main points. One is language is the point of departure. With bilingual students, we really need to be mindful of language. We have to have an understanding of what our students' language proficiency is, and if possible, what their home language proficiency is, because we need to know, are they very literate in their home language or are they not? And the New York City Department of Education actually has a tool called a lens, where you can assess students in the main languages in New York City. Building on linguistic foundations and background experience, again, we have to know what students know and build on that. Sometimes it's very easy for teachers and administrators to look at, oh my God, there's so much we need to do with this student. They know so little. And instead of taking the perspective to think about what do they know and how can we build on what they know. Because if we don't do that, then the task becomes monumental and we're not working with the student. We're interacting language, experience, and content. As we had talked before, we can't teach language abstractly. We have to make sure that language is really closely tied to content. And we have to think about mastering language in academic settings, making sure that students know how to almost code switch between when they talk like a lawyer, for example, or use academic language, when they talk like a scientist, and when they're just talking to their friends. And lastly, bilingualism and biliteracy as goals. In the past, often it was thought, okay, we have this bilingual student, we have this student who doesn't speak English well, we have to make them an English speaker, and completely completely deny or kind of ignore their bilingualism, their home language, whether it be Uzbeki or Nepalese or Bangala. Now the state has said we have to acknowledge that these students are bilingual and that they can make use of that language in learning the academic content. So for example, if they need to use Google Translate and put in some phrases there, they can use technology in order to understand the content that they're learning. Okay. So the New York Engaged Bilingual Common Core progressions are now up. They're not complete, but there's examples from each grade level, I think K through 12, and you can find it at this website. I'm going to now use the Common Core progressions, the New Language Arts progression, to look at how can we plan for these students. But before doing that, I wanted to talk a little bit about how these Common Core progressions are put together. So there's two sets of progressions for each grade. One is the New Language progression, and the other is the Home Language progression. The New Language progressions refer to the language that is currently targeted, and it's usually English. So they were formally referred to the English Language Arts standard for ELS. So the New Language progressions, I think what's important is all the modalities work together. So listening, speaking, reading, and writing all work together, and they support each other. The New Language refers to English or another language if the child is in a dual language program. And what's so great about them is they have receptive and productive dimensions of work. When we speak or when we use language, we can use it receptively, that means listening and reading, or we can use it expressively or productively, which means speaking and writing. And in these progressions, those modalities are targeted. And there's different levels of language development. As I went over at the beginning of this short webinar, I talked about different levels or stages of language proficiency. Here, it's the same idea, but they use different terms. Okay. So we're going to look at one right now. What you see on your screen is the New Language Arts progressions, and it's for grade 1. I'm going to just talk through how it looks. So at the beginning, it'll have Common Core standard. So that's the anchor standard. The anchor standards are the long-range standards that students are expected to attain by the end of 12th grade. So here it's to present information, findings, and supporting evidence such that learners can follow a line of reasoning, and the organization, development, and style are appropriate to task, purpose, and audience. So that's what we want students to be able to do by the end of 12th grade. Underneath it, you'll see what is expected in first grade. In first grade, in order for students to work up to that standard, we want students to describe people, places, and things with ideas and details clearly. So now, how do we do that for our emergent bilingual students? Here, right under the Common Core Grade 1 standard, you'll see the 5 different stages of language development: entering, emerging, transitioning, expanding, and commanding, which are very similar to the ones that I described earlier. And on the very left-hand side, you'll see that this is for receptive. So when we look at receptive, we'll see that there's a little L and a little R under entering. Those refer to the different modalities, either listening or reading. So this is where we can begin to think about what it means to plan for students when working on this Common Core objective. So if we focus in on entering, for listening, it suggests that we organize illustrated, pre-taught words on a label describing wheel to identify and classify people as the teacher reads aloud in partnership and/or teacher-led small groups. So what is so wonderful about this is it provides us with a baseline of what level of support we are expecting to provide our students. Here we're providing some language support through illustrated pre-taught words, and I think that's so important because the visual goes along with some prior knowledge that they were pre-taught. And in addition, we're providing support with partnership or teacher-led small groups. So students are not doing this on their own. They're actually working in partnership with students, with others, either teachers or students. On the very bottom of this column, you'll see it says in the new and or the home language. So that's where that last goal of the Common Core by the Progressions Initiative resides. We can do this activity in English, but we also can include them in their home language. So as we're thinking about how do we plan for an activity, we're thinking about how can we differentiate for students who are at the entering stage. What kinds of things do we need to prepare in terms of pre-teaching them, in terms of the materials they have, and in setting up the groups and the configurations in which they work. I now want to look at how that looks at transitioning. So if we look at the same thing where it says L, transitioning, here we see that they're organizing words and phrases from a bank on a partially completed describing wheel with teachers as teacher reads aloud in partnership, small group, or whole class setting. So here we see the level of support has changed for students who are kind of intermediate, or they're moving from being beginners to intermediate. So now they don't have as much visual support. They're really using words and they're using phrases. But there is still some support because there's a partially completed describing wheel. They're working in partnership, and they're working in bigger groups, whole class settings, where it's more difficult for students. And at the very bottom, it's in the new and occasionally in the home language. So sometimes there can be home language support. So in looking at these Common Core state standards, the bilingual progressions, we see that as we analyze and look at the different levels of language development, they give us a pretty structured idea of how we can support students at each of those stages. Do we provide visuals? Do we provide words? Or do we provide phrases? Or what kinds of configurations do we provide students with? And what is the level of support in their home language? How can we think about that? And I love this tool because it helps us to really think about how can we meet the rigorous goals such as the Common Core State Standards for students who are all learning language at the same time. I think we have to be mindful that emergent bilingual students are learning the content of literacy, but they're also learning language. So I hope that you also look at the website that I had shown you previously, because there are many resources there, and have a great time as you continue to think about and plan for your emergent bilingual students.